So now we're going to move on to functions. What do we know about functions? Let's see. Joe, what do you know about functions? Just one thing.
Functions are just small modules of code that try to isolate a certain operation.
Sure, so you can use functions for encapsulation. What about Tanner? What do you know about functions?
This is kind of the part where the code does something.
Yeah. So you could think of it having like a button, and you can hit the button, and then it goes and it runs something. Let's see. What about Ben?
Functions are objects.
Functions are objects. Nice. Extra points. Let's see. Who else wants to go? William, did you want to go?
I know that the parameters can be passed in willy-nilly.
Yeah, so you can pass arguments, and there's parameters that hold values. Awesome. So these are all true. So the way that I think of functions are they're an object, just like Ben said, but they're an object that does something. And the fact that functions are objects in JavaScript is a really interesting concept. The fact that we can assign them to variables and pass them around as data, which we'll talk about more tomorrow when we get into like higher order functions, is really, really powerful. And so that's just a cool thing. And so we can pass them around. And like one metaphor that we use a lot at Hack Reactor is we talk about how a function is a blender. And we say, so a blender is an object, and you can have a factory that makes blenders. So if you have some constructor that's making more functions, for example, you could do that. And you can give the blender, I could give the blender to Grace, and Grace can give the blender to Kishore, for example. Or we could set the blender down, put some fruit in it, right, arguments, and press the button and make juice. And so once you press the button, that's running the function, and the metaphor of the button is those two parentheses. The fancy name for that is the invocation operator, but two parentheses next to each other. And so that's sort of the metaphor of how I think about a function as data, and also as something, a unit that has an action and that can be run.
So the nice thing that I've also heard about the description is it kind of takes care of some detail work that we don't then want to be worried about. So it's just a very easy way to do something that then you know it works. Kind of like abstracting it, so I don't have to really worry about, well, how does it figure out the cube of x or whatever. It just does it.
Yeah, and so it's totally. So when we get into more functional concepts, we talk about functions as units of abstraction and actions that we can then combine in interesting ways that can be very powerful.
Some people will think of the properties being the nouns and the functions being the verbs.
Yeah, absolutely, I like that. So functions being the verbs and objects being the nouns. Cool.
And functions are scoped.
Yeah, functions have scope. That's super, super important. So whenever we call a function, it creates a scope every time. That's important. Did you have a question, Mark?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out they were asking about nesting in the arrays chapter. Did we skip that?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what they were wondering.
Cool. Sweet. So we're just going to do an overview of the anatomy of the function really quick, and then we're going to go into nesting. I just kind of wanted to do something new, and then we're going to go back and see if we still remember the rules that don't change about, and we're going to apply that to nested data structures. So here's just a quick anatomy of a function, some keywords that are important. So we have like the function definition or declaration, and that includes things like the keyword function, the parentheses, and the entire function body. And I'm sorry for those of you who are colorblind. I put arrows to kind of help out there, but I don't know how else to visualize it. And so then we have the function name. You can have a function name, or you can save an anonymous function to a variable. Both ways you can refer to the function later, just like a variable. Then we have the parameters, which are A and B in this case here. A and B. And then our parameters get values when at call time. They get values when we pass them arguments here. And then call time is when we have the 2 parentheses. That's when we press that go button. And we also call that, so call time, invoking the function. I don't know, that's all I can think of right now.
Do we have to put var, I mean, do we have to, when we define it? You have to
No.
put- You don't, but
You
is
don't.
that a global scope thing, or?
Yeah, it's a hoisting thing, so I recommend that you always just say var function name equals function. Yeah, it has to do with hoisting and scope, and it can get a little hairy if you're not careful. So now we're going to look over some functions that you may or may not have seen before and kind of like identify the parts of these functions. So we have 4 of them. Some of them I took from jQuery. Has anyone here done jQuery before? Okay, cool. So a lot of people have done jQuery. So the first thing is the function definition. So where do we see some functions defined? So let's just go in a line. Let's start with the front this way.
Right, well, at the top, there's an anonymous function being assigned to name improver.
Yeah, so we're defining a function here. And then Rich.
We're looking for where we're assigning functions?
Or we're defining a
Oh,
function.
we're defining functions.
It could be assigning a variable, it could be anonymous.
And you got me, the body hide? No? Down there?
Both.
No clue.
Right there. That's our next one. We're defining a function there. It has no name. That's okay.
That one doesn't have a name?
Yep, there's no name.
Oh, it's just passing val.
So it's a function definition. It's also an argument. Yeah. And who sees the last one? Tanner?
There's a function on click there.
Right here. Function definition. So these are the function definitions in this code. Oh, and just for clarification, name improver function is this handy function that we use at Girl Develop It for when our friends have babies or they have names that need to be improved. Body.hide is a jQuery thing that's just going to hide the body. So if I just did just to here. Oh, wait, is there even jQuery? Yes. Oh, no, there's not jQuery. Let's see if it works. Oh, cool. So it does work. So body.hide will just hide it, and then .show will show it. And then array.forEach. ForEach is a native like iteration method. It's going to just loop over the array and call this function a bunch of times. And then button on click is another jQuery functionality, and it's just adding an event listener. So whenever you click on the button, it's going to console log this don't press my buttons. So that's just an explanation of what functions we're looking at right now. Cool. And so what about function names? And I use name a little bit loosely. I refer to it both as like the named function, as well as like a variable that has a function stored at it. So let's talk about where do we see function names. So can we start with just Grace, and we'll just keep going. So you can anticipate when you have to go next.
I don't see a name. For function?
Yeah, so like here, for example, would be a name.
Oh, okay.
So-
That's the name for the function
Yeah.
versus the variable.
Yeah,
It's
well, it's a
returned to.
variable. I'm using name here loosely to mean like both a variable name that is stored at and the name itself. Yeah, because there's another way. Like we could write function like this, function name improver, name stay same. So this is another one. So this is just a really complicated algorithm that will just keep your name the same versus this this other one, that will change your name and make it better. So this is another way to name our function.
Is that the same as the first declaration of a function, where you, in the sense that you're adding like an R in front of it versus adding it to the global? I don't know if that makes sense.
So when we
Do you never want to do that one that you just did, the same stay name or whatever? I don't know.
You could do it this way. The only thing about doing it this way is that your function name and definition is hoisted, and that can be like it can like get messy.
Yeah.
So it can get messy. So I just recommend that you always just use this one, because you know that the rules for variable hoisting and things are the same, and you don't have to keep track of this. And yeah, there's some situations like if you have two functions of the same name in the if-else statement, and then you run it after the if-else statement, then it can get mixed up and do things that you don't expect because of the way hoisting works in this case. Okay. So you can do it, but you just have to be careful. But just to be on the safe side, just always do it this way. It's not going to hurt you. It's just var, just one extra word. It's not going to make a big difference. So, okay. So back to where we were. Here's a name. Then we also have a name here. And then William. See any more names?
We just added one called name stay same.
Mm-hmm. What about any other ones?
I don't see any other ones.
What about hide? It's a name, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Cool. Kim, do you see any name?
On.
On, absolutely. On is a name. And Andy?
For each.
Yep, for each is a function name. Joe?
Log.
Yeah, log. See, are we missing any? Oh, there's one more. It's kind of a trick question though. Anyone see it?
Dollar?
Yeah, yeah, $sign. So this jQuery $sign is actually a function. It's not a special syntax. It's just a function. So you can imagine that jQuery somewhere in its library says var $sign equals a function, and then it like returns like a jQuery object somewhere, right? Oops. More like this. So some things that may seem a little different are actually following the same rules. And I find that very comforting, actually, to know that jQuery isn't doing something like totally crazy that I don't understand. Now what about function bodies? It's a little bit different than a function definition, just because a body is what's located between these two parentheses. I'm sorry, these two curly brackets. And the important thing, while you guys are searching for more function bodies, the important thing to note about a function body is that it's never run until call time. So the code located within those curly brackets is not interpreted until you call the function. So in this case, for name improver, since we're never calling it, this code here never runs, and it has no real value. Cool. So let's see, who is next?
Is the body before the dot hide the body of the function?
Not quite. So we're looking for two curly brackets. That's how we know it's a function body. Unless it's an object or an if statement, but on this slide.
How about after function val?
Yeah. So right here, we have a function body. And then Ben?
In the on function, the second parameter is and then starting to.
Yeah, so right here,
Yeah,
that's a function body. And Jake, what's important to remember about function bodies?
They the verbs.
Functions are verbs, that's true. You can what's it called? Phone a friend?
Oh, I
You
can't
want?
think of it. Kim, help me out. My lifeline.
What was the question?
What's important to remember about function bodies?
They're inside brackets.
Yes, that's true, but there's something else. I'm looking for like one specific thing. Anyone remember?
They're not called till.
Doesn't call.
Yes, so it's not run until we call the function. Awesome. Cool. Speaking of calling the function, we have this thing called call time invocation. So just for fun, we can improve someone's name. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. So I'm just going to put this function here. And notice, I just put name improver there. We have it. Right? When I type out name improver, it shows me what the function looks like. That's not call time. That's just me checking what is stored at that variable. Just like when we say var x equals 2, and I just type x, it returns 2. Same thing. So how many people here really love their name? No? Everyone? Oh, okay, so we have 3 people who really love their name. So everyone else could use some name improvement. So everyone else just volunteered. Full of tricks and traps. I mean, it's Halloween time. You know, it's time for those things. Okay, so of those people, all right, you can recommend a friend. Who wants to nominate someone?
Tanner.
Tanner, okay. And who has an adjective that I can borrow? Has to be a nice one. Can't be like stinky or something.
Buff.
Buff. Buff? Okay. Awesome. So, Colonel Tanner McBuffpants.
Nice.
You can call your lawyer and arrange a new name if you want. I know it's way better, right?
You're right on it.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to call you that for the rest of the day.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem. So notice here, so we have, let's just look at the inside of our function. That we have our parameter here, name, and our adjective here. And they have no value until we pass these parameters, Tanner and Buff, right? And then suddenly they have value, and suddenly the code in this line, in between inside the function body gets called. And so that timing, that order is really important. Cool. So, where else do we see call time?
Hide.
Yeah, hide. Here's a perfect example. So we're calling hide. Where else? So where did we leave off? So we had Jake and then Kevin. Where else do we see call time?
For each.
Yeah,
Sorry. Yeah.
right here. Absolutely. And then Kishore.
On.
Where?
On.
Yeah, on is call time. Let's see. So I guess we'll start again at John.
$?
Yeah, so here we're calling jQuery. Anything else? Oh, there's one more.
There's log and val.
Yeah, there's just log. So console.log. There's 2 of them. So.
Are you saying call time is another word for invocation?
Yeah, exactly the same.
But not on val because that's just a function.
Val
Function
here.
Val.
Parameter.
That's just,
Oh, that's a parameter name.
but that parentheses,
This one?
no.
That's defining the function.
Oh,
And
Yeah,
the
so you
parameters
see-
that are going to be passed into it.
Whenever you see the keyword function,
uh-huh.
followed by 2 parentheses, that's not call time. That's part of the function definition.
Got it.
So the main thing to pay attention to is just the keyword function. If it's followed by parentheses, then you know that that's going to be the parameters.
So like function val, that's like kind of inline definition and.
Yeah, so that's just an anonymous function that we're passing to for each, and then val is going to be a parameter to that function. Cool. So now I want to talk a little bit about the difference between arguments and parameters, and this is something that's like really confused by people. So they are different. They're not interchangeable. Invocation and call time mean the same thing. Arguments and parameters are fundamentally different. So parameters, like I was saying, are right after the function definition or the function keyword, and they're just placeholders. So they're like variables, right? They hold values, but before call time, they have no value. They are undefined. And the way they get a value is if you pass them arguments, just like when we were improving Tanner's name. What was it? Buff. So name and adj, when I'm walking through the code, at this line, the first line here, name and adj have no value. This isn't even run yet, so it skips to the end. And then once it gets here, that's when we're giving name and adjective the value. So Tanner and Buff are then given a value to our parameters, and order is important. So they map by order. So name is the first one. So the first argument is going to give the first parameter its name. So name is then Tanner, and then the second one, Buff, is then adj. And there's no way you can't mix up the order. The order is super, super important, and that's the only way that your code knows which argument goes to which parameter. Cool.
Which one? So name and adj are the parameters?
Yes.
And Tanner and Buff are the arguments?
Yes. And the words themselves aren't that important. It's just the concept that these are variable-like and that they're placeholders, and this is the actual value, right? And you can kind of tell that these are variable-like just because they don't have, they're not keywords like function or return, but they don't have quotes around them. They're not any other kind of data type. So where do we see, let's go through parameters. So we just said that name and adj are parameters. Where else do we see parameters? Where did we leave off? Did we leave off in Tanner?
Yeah, I get it first.
So parameters are just the placeholders.
All right. So after name improver,
Yeah.
those are your arguments. Okay.
You can phone a friend if you want.
How about after for each?
Close. So for each is actually a function that's being called.
Right.
But here, that's a parameter. Val, that's a parameter. And I think that's the only one because this function has no parameters. And then what about arguments? Where are we passing arguments? So arguments are passed to the function at call time. So Grace, I think it's your turn.
Would that
And
be
then what
something
about
like a click
arguments?
or the
Where are
button itself?
Yeah, click. So the click is an argument. It's just a string. And this function is also an argument.
Yeah, I was wondering if the for each isn't the function parameter,
Or I'm mixing up. Is that the argument?
So this is the argument right here.
the entire thing, the argument?
That's the argument. That function is the argument.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And where else do we see arguments?
My turn?
Mm-hmm.
The jQuery.
Yeah. So.
Button.
Oh yeah, here. So this is also an argument. Do you see any more, Kim? Yeah, don't press my buttons. So console.log in the console.log. Cool. Any questions about that? It's kind of a gray area. It's easy to get them confused. Any questions of clarification before I move on? Cool. So the next thing I want to talk about is what it means to return a value versus having side effect. So if you don't have an explicit return statement in your function, it's just going to return undefined. Okay? So if we want a function to return a value, we have to explicitly say return. And the thing about return is that it's going to immediately break out of the function and return that value. Whether it's in an if block or a for loop, it's just going to immediately return out of that function. So you have to be careful about where you place your return statements. But if you do, in fact, want your function to return a value, the only way you can do that is by having a return. And everything else that you do that's doing work is a side effect. So this console.log here is considered a side effect because it's not actually, this function is not actually returning anything. It's just console logging.
So if you change the assignment on a variable but don't return anything, that's a side effect of.
Totally, exactly. Or if you're creating DOM nodes and appending them inside of a function, that could be considered a side effect and not returning. So you have an explicit return statement, which you returns some data, right? Or you have side effects, and those are the two different things. Cool. So just a quick review. Where did we leave off? I think it's your turn, Andy, right? So what is this add this add function gonna return? This is testing your math skills.
7.
Hope you studied. Yeah, 7. Awesome. And take a moment and explain to the person next to you how you would change this add function so that it would add to 13. And you can't minus 1. Here, let me change this. Okay. Actually, it doesn't matter. Without someone, I did this the other day, and they're like, yeah, just a plus b minus 1. That's not what I'm asking. So yeah, explain to your partner how we get this to return 13 without doing any extra math. Just changing.
You change the function.
Change the function. So explain to someone next to you. Or in the chat, you can type it out if you want. So what we're changing is the function itself, not the arguments. What did you come up with? Anyone come up with any brilliant solutions? This complicated coding problem?
I would add a comma C so that the definition has A, comma B, comma C. Mm-hmm. And then I would return A plus, or B plus C.
Totally. And here we see that we don't need to use all the arguments or even do any work on parameters. We can just skip them, and JavaScript's really flexible like that. It doesn't mind. And even when we did only have 2 here, A and B, notice when we passed 3 arguments, it just ignored them. And that's one of the cool things about Java. It's one of the dangerous things about JavaScript, that flexibility, but it's also one of the cool things. And what comes from that, or a cool thing that we have in JavaScript that works with that, is this thing called the arguments keyword. And an arguments keyword is a special keyword in JavaScript that lives inside functions. And it gets a value of the arguments that you pass in the form of an array-like object. And what it would look like if we pass 3, 10, and 5 to our add function, and then we just console logged the arguments, it would log something that looks a lot like an array. It looks like an array of all the arguments in the order that you pass them. And so this is really powerful when you don't know how many arguments your function can take, so you can have that flexibility. Like maybe you're going to add several numbers, and you want to have it flexible. You can add a bunch of them, so you can loop through it and just add it that way. Another cool thing that you can do with the arguments keyword is you can have different versions of functions. So you can say, like, if you pass 3 arguments, do this. If you pass 5 arguments, do this. So you can have different options for how your function works.
So if we define the function with the empty brackets instead of a comma b, it's just empty. But when you call the function, you add a bunch, say 3, 4 arguments or arguments. Then to access those, you have to kind of loop through this arguments list or array. I mean.
Yeah. So if you had a bunch.
Because that's how the only way you reference them.
I might have that slide. No, I don't. So if you did want to have this all add together, what you could do is, do our for loop. Remember this? So arguments is not an array, but it does have a .length property, which is handy. And then we can have like results equals 0, and then we can say results plus equals arguments at I. And so this is how we would then just like, if you wanted to add all these arguments, hopefully I have no syntax errors. Let's see. Cool. So 138. So that's one use case. Cool. So how then would we, if we wanted to have it equal 18, using the arguments keyword, what would we change in the add function? So if we wanted to add something here.
Arguments 2.
Yep. So it would be arguments bracket 2, and that would return 18. Cool. Awesome. And so I said it really isn't an array, it's an array-like object. What does that mean? Why is that important to us? It's important mostly for when you are trying to use array methods on it. It won't have slice, for example, which is a little unfortunate, but there are methods that there are ways that you can turn it into an array, and that it's kind of a little bit out of the scope of what we're doing because it goes into the prototype, but it's something like, I could even be typing this wrong, it's like prototype.call slice.call something like this. So you can just Google it, actually, the exact syntax. I can't remember.
I pasted it in chat.
Is it? Okay, cool. Argument 0. Thank you. So this would be an example of how you would turn it into an array.
And it's array. It's array.prototype.
Thank you. Awesome. So if you want to use any of the handy array methods, you will first have to turn it into a real array, and then you can do those operations. But if you're trying to do it without it, it's going to give you an error. Cool. Oh, also functions are objects, which means those rules that we were talking about before, the dot notation, the bracket notation, remain the same. I'm not going to go into a whole spiel about it, but I hope by now that you trust me. I don't have to show you all the examples that dot notation and bracket notation work the same on functions, and you actually use this a lot for when you're making constructors.